At 10,184 meters below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in a place with no sunlight, no oxygen from the surface, and pressure strong enough to crush a submarine like a soda can, cameras captured something moving. It was not a fish anyone recognized. It was not a shape in any scientific catalog. The footage came back to the surface, and for the first time in decades, marine biologists sat in a room and admitted they did not know what they were looking at. Not a guess, not a theory, just silence, and then the same question repeated by everyone in that room. What exactly did we just film at the bottom of the world? The place where this happened is called the Mariana Trench. And if you have never tried to picture how deep 36,000 feet actually is, here's the comparison that scientists themselves use when they want people to understand the true scale of it. If Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on the surface of the Earth, was lifted from its base and dropped upside down into the deepest point of this trench, its peak would still sit more than 2 kilometers below the waves. That deepest point has a name. It is called Challenger Deep, and it reaches approximately 10,184 meters, or 36,000 hours, 37 feet, beneath the surface of the ocean. At that depth, the water pressure is roughly 100 times greater than what we experience standing on land, which works out to something close to 8 tons of force pressing on every single square inch of anything sitting down there. To put that in human terms, it is the equivalent of 40 jumbo jets stacked directly on top of a single person. Nothing about that environment was built to support life as we understand it, and for most of the 20th century, scientists genuinely assumed almost nothing complex could survive at that depth. And yet, life is there. It's not just surviving in some fragile, barely clinging on way, but in certain places, thriving in ways that have left the scientists studying it more confused than confident about how much they actually understand about their own planet. For most of human history, the Mariana Trench was simply unreachable, a black spot on every map of the ocean floor, a place people knew existed only because sound waves and dropped weights told them something was down there. It was first identified in 1875 during the Challenger expedition, a British Royal Navy mission that spent 4 years mapping the world's oceans, using little more than weighted ropes, patience, and a level of persistence that modern researchers still describe with genuine respect. For almost 100 years after that expedition ended, no human being ever saw the bottom of the trench with their own eyes. That changed in 1960, when Jacques Picard and Don Walsh descended in a vessel called the Trieste and became the first people in history to reach Challenger Deep. What they found down there was a flash of white sediment and almost nothing else visible in their limited lighting, and the mission was considered such a singular, dangerous achievement that no one attempted to repeat it for more than 50 years. It was not until 2012 that filmmaker James Cameron made a solo descent in a submersible called the Deep Sea Challenger, a vessel he helped design and fund almost entirely through his own resources. And he came back describing the bottom as desolate, alien, and unlike anywhere else on the planet he had ever filmed. Since Cameron's dive, explorer Victor Vescovo and his team completed the Five Deeps expedition, a project that set out to reach the deepest point of every ocean on Earth. And their dives into the Mariana Trench used increasingly advanced camera and sonar systems that captured footage in far greater detail than anything available to earlier expeditions. Each time a new team reaches the bottom, they see something that was not documented in any previous record, and that pattern alone should tell you something important about how much is actually still left to discover down there. In 2024, a Chinese-crewed submersible named Fendoje, which translates to striver, descended into the Mariana Trench 23 separate times as part of a sustained, methodical research campaign rather than a single dramatic dive designed for headlines. This was a deliberate, repeated effort to map what actually lives at depths most of humanity simply assumes are empty, dark, and lifeless. What the crew found, at depths ranging from roughly 8,200 feet down to over 31,000 feet, was described in a 2025 study published in the journal Nature as the deepest and most extensive community of chemosynthetic life ever documented on Earth. Chemosynthetic simply means these organisms are not powered by the sun the way almost everything else on this planet is. Sunlight cannot reach anywhere close to those depths, so instead, these communities pull their energy directly from chemical reactions, using hydrogen sulfide and methane that seep up through cracks in the seafloor itself, a process that has nothing to do with photosynthesis and everything to do with raw planetary chemistry. Dense clusters of tube worms and bivalve mollusks were found clinging to life in total darkness, in cold that would stop a human heart within minutes, feeding on chemistry instead of light, forming colonies that researchers compared in scale to entire underwater cities built around cracks in the Earth's crust. When the footage was reviewed by the research team, several of the specimens did not immediately match any previously cataloged species. That detail did not make it into most of the mainstream headlines, but it sits quietly inside the actual data from the expedition, and it raises an obvious question that deserves more attention than it has received. If a coordinated, well-funded, repeated expedition using state-of-the-art submersibles, is still bringing back organisms nobody can immediately classify? What does that say about everything nobody has looked at yet, and the vast stretches of trench they have not even visited? This is where the individual creatures start to matter, because the trench is not just producing volume, it is producing biology that does not behave the way biology is supposed to behave, according to the textbooks most of us grew up learning from. In 2017, researchers recorded the Mariana snailfish at a depth of roughly 8,000 meters, making it the deepest living fish ever documented anywhere in Earth's oceans. It is a translucent, almost ghost-like animal, gliding along the seafloor in small groups and feeding on tiny crustaceans and shrimp that share its extreme environment. On its own, that might sound like an interesting but fully explainable discovery, filed away neatly in a marine biology textbook, except fish are not supposed to be able to survive at that depth at all. The pressure should destabilize the proteins in their cells to the point of structural failure. And for a long time, most marine biologists assumed nothing with a spine could function that far down in the water column. The snailfish exists anyway, thriving in numbers large enough to be observed in groups. And scientists still do not have a complete explanation for how its cellular structure resists a collapse that basic biology insists should happen under that much pressure. Researchers studying the snailfish have begun looking closely at specific proteins in its muscle tissue, hoping to understand exactly what allows those proteins to remain stable when every basic principle of pressure, physics, says they should not. Then there is the supergiant amphipod, a shrimp-like crustacean first documented living in the trench during a 2019 expedition, and one of the clearest examples of a phenomenon called deep-sea gigantism. Amphipods living near the surface of the ocean typically stay small, growing to only a few centimeters in length over their entire lives. In the trench, some of these same general creatures exceed 30 centimeters, transforming from something you could mistake for a piece of drifting debris into an armored insect-like animal, large enough to be genuinely startling on camera. Nobody has ever produced a fully agreed-upon explanation for why this gigantism happens, though there are competing theories involving oxygen levels, metabolism, and the near-total absence of predators at those depths. What makes the supergiant amphipod particularly strange is what scientists discovered when they examined its exoskeleton in detail. Instead of relying purely on calcium the way most crustaceans do, this animal appears to incorporate aluminum, most likely absorbed from sediment on the seafloor itself, directly into the structure of its shell. Researchers believe this may help reinforce the exoskeleton against the crushing pressure at that depth, functioning almost like a natural version of alloy armor. But the exact biochemical mechanism behind it is still not fully understood by anyone studying the species. Giant isopods, distant relatives of the woodlice you might find under a rock in your garden, show a similar pattern of unexplained gigantism in the same general environment, growing to sizes that dwarf their shallow water relatives, for reasons science has not fully pinned down. An animal building armor out of a metal most people associate with soda cans and airplane parts is not something biology textbooks were prepared to explain when they were first written. Even stranger are the xenophyophores, single-celled organisms discovered at depths of around 10. 6 kilometers using drop cams, specialized cameras lowered into the trench equipped with lights and recording systems designed to survive pressures that would instantly destroy most conventional equipment. These are not small, microscopic cells in the way most single-celled organisms are typically imagined. Some of them grow to roughly the size of a mango, which for something made of a single cell is almost impossible to reconcile with everything else known about cellular biology and the physical limits of a single membrane holding itself together. They are also extremely fragile, which has made them difficult to bring to the surface intact, meaning most of what scientists actually know about them comes directly from camera footage rather than physical specimens they can dissect and study under a microscope in a controlled lab environment. In 2016, during a NOAA expedition on the Enigma seamount, cameras also captured a translucent jellyfish at a depth of roughly 3,700 meters that has still not been officially classified or given a formal scientific name years later. It has 2 distinct sets of tentacles, one long and one short, and footage shows it holding almost completely still for long stretches of time. A behavior researchers believe may be a deliberate hunting strategy rather than any sign of the animal being injured or dying. An unnamed species, filmed clearly on camera, sitting in scientific limbo for years afterward, is not the kind of loose end most people expect from modern, well-funded marine biology in an age when we can photograph individual atoms. The Dumbo octopus adds another layer to this same pattern of strangeness hiding in plain sight on camera footage. Named after the Disney character because of the ear-like fins that flap gently on either side of its head, it holds the record as the deepest living octopus known on the planet. Unlike most other octopus species, the Dumbo octopus does not possess an ink sac, largely because it encounters so few predators at the depths where it lives that the evolutionary need for a defensive ink cloud simply disappeared over time. These animals typically grow to between 18 and 30 centimeters, but the largest individual ever recorded measured a staggering 8 meters, nearly 6 feet across, an outlier so far beyond the typical range that researchers still discuss what conditions might allow a single individual to grow that large. Alongside it in the depths lives the barrel-eye fish, an animal with a completely transparent head, housing 2 barrel-shaped eyes that point mostly upward, allowing it to detect the faint silhouettes of prey moving above it in near total darkness. Scientists did not even know the barrel-eye fish existed until 1939, when one was pulled up from roughly 2,500 feet below the surface, and even now, decades later, researchers still know remarkably little about its life cycle or reproductive patterns. Every one of these creatures was, at some point, footage that nobody could initially explain, filed under mystery before it eventually earned a name, a classification, and a place in a textbook. The reason so much of this remains unresolved comes down to a number that most people have never heard. And once you hear it, the entire trench starts to look completely different. A study on ocean exploration found that humans have mapped at high resolution just 0.01% of the deep seafloor below 656 feet, an area roughly equivalent in size to the state of Rhode Island. That is not a typo, and it is not a rounding error introduced by careless reporting. It means that for every single square kilometer of deep ocean floor that has been closely examined by cameras, sonar, or submersibles, there are roughly 100,000 square kilometers that have never been seen by a single human being or a single piece of equipment in the entire history of our species. We have better maps of the surface of Mars and the far side of the Moon than we have of our own ocean floor, a fact that sounds almost absurd until you actually sit with the logistics and cost involved in reaching these depths compared to pointing a telescope at the sky. Every time a new expedition drops a camera into a previously unexamined stretch of trench, there's a real, non-zero chance that whatever appears in that footage will be something science has never recorded before in any form. That is not speculation dressed up to sound dramatic. That is simply the mathematical reality of how little of this environment has actually been surveyed by anyone ever at any point in human history. Even with how little of the trench has been explored, human presence has still managed to leave a mark at the very bottom of it, and that fact by itself says something uncomfortable about the reach of our species. During one of the deep dives conducted as part of the Five Deeps expedition, researchers using advanced imaging equipment recorded a plastic bag resting on the seafloor at the deepest point on Earth, alongside other scattered debris that had somehow drifted or sunk down across thousands of meters of open water to settle in a place humans had barely visited. It is a strange kind of contradiction to sit with. We have observed trash reaching the most remote, crushing, lightless environment on the entire planet decades before we have managed to systematically document the biology living in that same environment. That contrast is not just a piece of trivia about pollution. It is a direct illustration of exactly how far behind our scientific mapping efforts are compared to the reach of human activity, and it raises a genuinely uncomfortable question about what else might be sitting down there, undocumented, simply because nobody with a camera and the right equipment has happened to pass over that exact stretch of seafloor yet. The implications of everything found so far reach well beyond simple curiosity about strange-looking fish and oversized crustaceans. Researchers studying how organisms like the Mariana snailfish and the supergiant amphipod survive crushing pressure are looking closely at the proteins and cellular structures these animals have evolved, because understanding pressure resistance at a molecular level has genuine practical applications in fields like medicine and materials science here on the surface. If an organism has found a biological solution to a problem that human engineering still struggles with, that solution is worth understanding in detail rather than simply cataloging it and moving on to the next specimen. There is also a growing, increasingly serious connection between hadal-zone research, the scientific term for the deepest ocean trenches, and the search for life beyond Earth entirely. Moons like Europa and Enceladus are believed to have oceans of liquid water sealed beneath thick layers of ice, with no sunlight reaching those depths at all, an environment that is, in several important ways, remarkably similar to the chemosynthetic ecosystems found in the Mariana Trench. Some astrobiologists studying these Earth-based hadal ecosystems have pointed out that if life can generate its own energy from chemical reactions in total darkness on our own planet, in one of the most hostile environments Earth has to offer any living thing, there's no obvious scientific reason the same basic process could not occur on a distant moon under similarly extreme conditions millions of kilometers away. Learning what actually lives in the Mariana Trench is no longer just an ocean story confined to marine biology journals. It has quietly become part of the actual working roadmap for how scientists think about the possibility of life existing anywhere else in the universe. None of this is being investigated at anywhere near the pace you might expect, given how significant the stakes genuinely are for both biology and astrobiology combined. Deep sea expeditions require submersibles, capable of withstanding crushing pressure without failing, specialized cameras that can operate reliably in total darkness for extended periods, and research vessels that can support months-long missions far from any port, all of which comes at an extraordinary financial cost that few institutions can absorb on a regular basis. Only a small number of countries and research institutions currently have both the technology and the sustained funding to conduct these dives at all, which means the actual pace of discovery is directly limited by budgets and available resources, rather than by any shortage of scientific interest or curiosity. Every single dive that does happen tends to produce new findings of some kind, which strongly suggests that the limiting factor here has never really been whether there is more to find in the trench, but simply whether anyone can afford to keep going back and looking properly. That creates an uncomfortable reality where the discovery of new species, new behaviors, and potentially entirely new categories of life is being paced not by the natural boundaries of the ocean itself, but by funding cycles, shifting national priorities, and the very small number of research teams currently equipped to operate at these depths at all. So when footage comes back from 36,000 feet showing an organism that does not immediately match anything in the existing scientific record, the honest answer is not that science has somehow been fooled, and it is not that something impossible has occurred down there in the dark. The honest answer is that science has only just begun looking properly, and the tools capable of looking with real precision have existed for less than a single generation of researchers. Every expedition into the Mariana Trench operates at the very edge of what has already been mapped, which means every camera lowered into that darkness carries a genuine, measurable chance of recording something that has simply never been seen by another human being before in the entire history of our species. The trench itself has not changed. It has been sitting there for millions of years, largely undisturbed, developing its own biology in almost complete isolation from the rest of the planet above it. What has changed is our ability to finally point a camera into that darkness and start asking, seriously and systematically, what is actually down there waiting to be found. The footage that keeps coming back from these expeditions suggests we are only at the very beginning of that answer, and the next dive, wherever it happens to point its lights next, may very well capture something that once again leaves an entire room of trained scientists sitting in complete silence, trying to figure out exactly what they are looking at on the screen in front of them.